Okay, next we have David Pavlacky, the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, and he's going to enlighten us on how lesser prairie chicken conservation contributes to other critters.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for attending. It's great to be here at the foot of the Sierras. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about how Farm Bill programs for the lesser prairie chicken contribute to umbrella species conservation to grassland birds. And I'd like to acknowledge the co-authors of this study, Ann Barta Savage, Rich Iovana, and Christian Hagen. So I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about the role of conservation science in planning and management. So, science to support conservation planning is important for identifying conservation problems and threats, species vulnerability and prioritization, and also to estimate population status and trend. So this has been exemplified fairly well in a recent study by Rosenberg and others, including Arvind Punjabi with the Bird Conservancy, in a recent paper in Science that showed that we have lost about 3 billion birds over the last 50 years in the continental US. So I think this research is important because it helps us identify potential objectives, lets us allocate resources to important conservation questions, and then it also kind of allows us to make sure we're solving the right problems. I would also say that if we're really interested in solving some of these problems, we need to move into more of a decision-making and adaptive management framework. And these focus on measurable objectives, and we can make state-dependent management decisions based on that population status. We can evaluate the effectiveness of management actions. And then, of course, we can learn to make better management decisions. So in today's talk, I'm going to mainly focus on that effectiveness monitoring piece. And so this is sort of outlined here in the 9-step NRCS planning process. So let's say we were able to conduct analysis and execute it perfectly in phase 1. But if that research is not resting on a foundation of decision-making and evaluation, well, then we're really not solving some of these big problems that we need to address. So I would say if we're working with a limited budget, we've got to make sure that this conservation science is integrated within a system of decision-making and evaluation. So that brings us to multi-species bird conservation, and there's at least 2 approaches for implementing this. Landscape conservation focuses on landscape processes to manage whole assemblages of species. Then we have umbrella species or surrogate species conservation, and this is where an umbrella species requires a large area of habitat, and then habitat management also protects many of the less spatially demanding species. So one of the problems with these approaches is often they're implemented by assuming that they're positively affecting the wide assemblages of species. So here is a really important role for effectiveness monitoring to provide confidence to land managers that we're actually meeting our conservation targets. And then I'd also like to say umbrella species, the hypothesis for umbrella species has often been studied through habitat relationships and like overlaying species distribution models. But I would say a more direct test of the hypothesis is to evaluate habitat management for the umbrella species. So for the Lesser Prairie-Chicken Initiative, there's a range-wide conservation plan that shows us that 95% of the prairie chicken range is on private land, and this highlights the importance of partnerships between private landowners and resource professionals. So this is a conservation planning piece. And then we think about the management actions, some of the more important management actions under the Farm Bill to manage lesser prairie chicken habitat are prescribed grazing. So this addresses habitat condition and degradation through sustainable stocking rates and rest rotation schedules. Conservation Reserve Program addresses habitat loss and fragmentation, although not necessarily designed for that purpose. And we study 2 flavors of CRP, native and introduced CRP. And our research questions are, can these programs for the lesser prairie chicken be used to manage population densities of grassland birds. We looked at prescribed grazing relative to reference grasslands and native and introduced CRP relative to agricultural landscapes. And then we asked, do these programs contribute to regional population sizes of grassland birds? And here we looked at the relative contributions of those practices and how they affect the regional bird population. So the study area is the occupied range of the lesser prairie chicken plus 16 kilometer buffer. Those color-coded regions are ecoregions that are important to the chicken from the conservation plan. And we conducted bird monitoring in this region using the Integrated Monitoring and Bird Conservation Regions program for the Playa Lakes joint venture. And here we generated a spatially balanced sample of 1 square kilometer grid cells. So I should point out these sampling locations were designed to represent the reference categories. So this is the, basically represents the average conditions within the occupied range. So then we conducted a study to investigate prescribed grazing using an impact reference design where we sampled 30 grids on 17 ranches enrolled in LPCI prescribed grazing. And we contrasted this with 97 samples on reference grasslands. For Conservation Reserve Program in 2016, we sampled 33 grids on native CRP, shown in purple. Maybe I didn't point out that the orange stars are those prescribed grazing lands, and the reference grasslands are shown in yellow. And here, 33 grids on native CRP planting shown in purple, 33 grids on introduced CRP in blue, in comparison to 48 agricultural landscapes in the occupied range. So again, those reference categories are from the base IMBCR program, and then we introduced this auxiliary stratification scheme to look at the control impact design, impact reference design. So our methods, we use distance sampling to estimate population density as the mean number of individuals among the 1 square kilometer grid cells. Population size is the total number of individuals in the study area. And so we use design-based inference for this. And what I mean by that is we aggregated strata-level estimates from the IMBCR program to estimate total population size in the occupied range. And here's a little, and we use a delta method to approximate the variance for that. And here's a little cartoon of our sample design where we have distance intervals nested within point counts nested within grid cells. Then we have the grid cells are nested within strata. That's where our grit sample draw is. And then we have strata nested within the occupied range of the lesser prairie chicken. I should point out this design-based inference requires having a random, or in this case, spatially balanced sample design in order to generate our valid estimates of population size. So, jump straight to the results. I apologize for presenting such a large table, but don't worry, I'm going to walk you through it. So can CRP be used to manage densities of grassland birds? Well, we have the species on the rows here, and across the columns here, we have our contrast between native CRP and ag land and introduced CRP and ag land. And delta here is just the difference and that effect size for the density estimates, and these are 90% confidence intervals. So the species shown in orange there responded positively to both native and introduced CRP. A few species only responded to introduced CRP. And of course, we had several species that also showed negative responses to CRP, but point out the identities of these species are species you'd expect from more open or agricultural landscapes, you know, brown-headed cowbird, horned lark, killdeer, ringneck pheasant. And interestingly, most species showed larger effects for introduced CRP than native CRP. So this was a surprise to us, with the exception of the grasshopper sparrow. And what you're looking at here is the the confidence intervals, for that effect of introduced CRP don't include that value for native CRP. So for prescribed grazing, can we use this to manage densities of grassland birds? So the table's set up the same way. We found several species responded positively compared to reference grasslands to the prescribed grazing practice. Several species showed the opposite effect, where their densities were higher in those reference grasslands than the prescribed grazing practice. So it's interesting, we see that some game species, northern bobwhite, favored that prescribed grazing where scaled quail did not. So now I'm going to jump to, can we use these practices to evaluate population consequences in the occupied range? So again, another big busy table, but I'll walk you through it. What we have are obligates, grassland obligates on the top panel. So these are species that are depend on grassland vegetation. And then we have a whole suite of facultative or generalist species that use grassland as a substantial part of their life histories, but also use other vegetation types. The blue corresponds to prescribed grazing, yellow introduced CRP, white native CRP, and then you can see the breakdown for how much of that conservation practice is available in the occupied range. So a lot more native CRP and small doses of prescribed grazing and introduced CRP. The x-axis here is the contribution to population size in the occupied range expressed as a percentage. And the other thing I want to point out is this vertical dash line. That's the availability of conservation in the occupied range. So about 10% of the land area is currently under conservation. And then these are 90% confidence intervals on those contribution estimates. So the first thing that jumped out at the only species that showed population responses disproportionate above the availability of conservation in the region were 3 grassland obligates, cassin sparrow, eastern meadowlark, and grasshopper sparrow. So the confidence intervals here don't include that 10%. So we're interpreting this as responses disproportionate to the availability in the region. And of course, several species showed less than proportional responses to conservation. But interestingly, most of those species were these generalist species that also use other vegetation types. But we also see a grassland obligate such as the burrowing owl that requires keystone features, prairie dog towns. One of the main findings is the rest of the species, 21 species, responded what we're interpreting as contributions in proportion to the availability of conservation in the region. So the confidence intervals for these species all include that 10% of the landmass in conservation. So that, remember, this is the contribution to population size expressed as a percentage of the occupied population size in the occupied range. So what does this mean in terms of absolute population sizes? So we know from the survey-wide breeding bird survey that grasshopper sparrows are declining to the tune of about 3% per year. Our study showed that conservation accounted for 16% of the grasshopper sparrow in the occupied range, and this corresponds to a population increase of over 1.5 million birds. For the cassin sparrow, we really don't see any population declines. The practices accounted for 17% of the cassin sparrow population with a population increase of over 500,000. We speculate here as to wondering whether or not, if this land was not under conservation, if we would indeed see a population decline for this otherwise common species. For the eastern meadowlark, declining at over 3% per year, and the practices conserved 21% of the population, and that amounted to over 200,000 individuals for eastern meadowlark. So when we look at the population responses for those 24 species that responded positively to the practices, we see 400,000 individuals can be attributed to prescribed grazing. And when we look at CRP, CRP conserved roughly 3.9 million individuals across those 24 species. And so there's a lot more CRP in this landscape, which accounts for that number. But when we look across those, the total conservation benefit was over 4.3 million individuals. So it's a meaningful conservation outcome from these practices. And if we look at just the declining species, 16 of those species were declining. The breeding bird survey says 2% population decline across those 16 species. And we found the mean percentage of populations conserved by the Farm Bill practices was 13%. So what this suggests is that these conservation practices are kind of shoring up the populations in the southern plains. So they're buoyed potentially by these conservation practices, and that might be why we see this only modest decline over time. So in conclusion, the Farm Bill programs for the lesser prairie chicken appear to be scaling up to meet recovery goals for grassland birds. So CRP is useful for potentially mitigating against habitat loss and fragmentation, and prescribed grazing can be used to manage for habitat condition, habitat degradation. We think these data are useful for predicting population consequences to enrollment and expiry over time. So we can use these data in a smart way to sort of understand the consequences of that. And then we use effectiveness monitoring to learn about the success of conservation actions, and we think this provides confidence and accountability for managing wildlife in the public trust. And these voluntary programs that also address landowner interests also seem to contribute to positive conservation outcomes for grassland birds. So I have a large number of people to thank for the success of this project. It really did take a large team to be able to pull this off. Of course, the funding agencies, we could not have done this work without substantial investment by these organizations. I suppose I have to thank the prairie chicken for a lot of these conservation increases, but mainly I'd like to thank the landowners for allowing us to do bird surveys on their property. And really, we have the landowners to thank for these large conservation outcomes in these regions. So real pat on the back to these landowners. And that concludes my talk. If I have time, I'll take any questions.
Opportunity while I switch presentations. Any questions for David? I have one. The 4.3 million extra birds, those are kind of like, of the birds that are on the landscape, there could be, I don't know how many millions. 4.3 million are there because of those practices?
So because we have the question was the 4.3 million there because of those conservation practices? So we have this impact reference design. So we don't have a backy design to actually show this over time. Yet it's clear that those 4.3 million individuals across those 24 species were occurring on these conservation investments. And so we can use that, that impact reference design to use that as our treatment effect and then make inference to that population change.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. All right, thanks, Dave.